It started with a faint buzz, a single notification, cutting through the stillness of Jane's quiet apartment on an otherwise normal night. It was a voicemail. She hadn't noticed any missed calls. Assuming it was a spam message, she shrugged and pressed play. But as soon as the voice began, her heart dropped. It was low, barely a whisper, yet each word felt like a creeping shadow slithering through her mind. The voice recited her day, every step she had taken. The voice described the clothes she wore, the book she was reading at the coffee shop, even the seat she'd chosen. Her hands began to tremble. How could anyone know these details? By the time the message ended, Jane was gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. She deleted it, brushing off the unsettling feeling with the belief that it had to be some twisted prank. But as she lay in bed that night, the voice echoed in her mind, each word replaying over and over, twisting her unease into terror. 2 days later, another voicemail arrived. This time, she froze before listening, a gnawing fear gripping her stomach. She almost ignored it, but curiosity clawed at her. Maybe it was nothing, she told herself. But as the message played, her blood turned to ice. The same voice, calm and composed, began to recount her day once more. It spoke of her trip to the grocery store, her short conversation with the cashier, even the moment she hesitated over a particular item. Jane's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, like a shadow lurking in the corners of her life, observing every move she made. She hung up immediately, her breath shallow as her mind raced. Someone was following her, someone who knew her every action. She could no longer convince herself it was a prank. That night, she called her friend Laura, her voice shaking as she described the messages. Laura tried to reassure her, insisting it was probably a sick joke, maybe even someone from work messing with her. Still, she offered to stay over, and for the first time in days, Jane felt a glimmer of comfort. But even with Laura by her side, Jane couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The air in her apartment felt thick, heavy, like it was closing in on her. She checked every lock, every window, yet a lingering fear settled deep within her. Despite her friend's comforting presence, Jane felt utterly alone. The next morning, just as she thought the worst had passed, her phone buzzed with another voicemail. Her heart dropped. She didn't want to listen, didn't want to hear that voice again, but an insidious curiosity forced her to press play. This time, the voice was slower, colder, as if savoring each word. It described her lying in bed, the light from her alarm clock casting a faint glow across her face. Then, in a chilling whisper, the voice added, "You look peaceful when you sleep." Jane nearly dropped the phone, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst from her chest. She stumbled to her feet, frantically searching the apartment, feeling as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. She ran to the window, looking out into the night, desperate to find any sign of the person tormenting her. But the street was empty. When she called the police, they listened patiently, but couldn't offer much help. There was no traceable number, no indication of where the calls were coming from. They assured her they'd investigate, but the doubt in their voices only deepened her dread. She was on her own. The following days were torture. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She kept her phone on silent, afraid of hearing that voice again. Yet, as much as she tried to avoid it, the messages kept coming. One night, the message was different. She hesitated longer than usual before listening, her stomach a twisted knot of fear. The voice was closer, almost as though it was coming from right behind her. It described her sitting on her couch, alone, bathed in the dim light of her living room. Then, in a tone dripping with malice, it whispered, "Look behind you." Paralyzed, Jane didn't dare turn around. She sat frozen, her mind screaming as a cold wave of terror washed over her. Finally, she forced herself to look, her heart pounding louder with every second. But there was nothing there, just an empty room. She clutched her phone, tears streaming down her face, feeling as if her sanity was slipping away. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, the constant fear gnawing at her like a dark presence lurking in every shadow. Desperate, she confided in Laura once more, who urged her to stay with her instead. But even away from her apartment, the fear followed her. That night, as she lay in Laura's guest room, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to listen but couldn't resist. With trembling hands, she pressed play. The voice was angrier, harsher, as it recounted her desperate attempt to escape. "You can't hide from me. You'll always be alone. Always." That was the breaking point. Jane packed her things, determined to leave town, to start over somewhere far away where this nightmare couldn't reach her. She drove through the night, glancing in her rearview mirror every few minutes, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness behind her. As she finally crossed the city limits, her phone buzzed one last time. She didn't want to listen, didn't want to feel that dread seep into her soul again, but something compelled her to press play. This time, the voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through her like a knife. "You think you've escaped? I'm already there, waiting." Her heart stopped, her mind racing with terror. She glanced around the car, the empty road stretching endlessly ahead. But no matter how far she ran, she knew she could never escape the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The road stretched out before her, dark and foreboding, as she realized that her nightmare was only beginning. It started with a distant, almost imperceptible feeling. Something was off, something strange in the house Erin had just moved into. She was excited to be living on her own, finally free from the constraints of sharing space with others. But that excitement began to wane as she noticed a curious object in the corner of her basement, an old mannequin standing still and silent. The mannequin was peculiar. It had no face, no distinct features. Just a blank, smooth surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should be, yet somehow it felt like it was watching her. Erin hadn't placed it there. It came with the house. The real estate agent had mentioned nothing about it, and she had assumed it was left behind by the previous owners. Days went by, and Erin left it alone, thinking it added a quirky touch to the old place. But over time, an unsettling pattern began to form. She'd go down to the basement to do laundry, and each time, the mannequin would appear slightly closer. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Maybe she hadn't noticed its position properly the last time, but the movements were unmistakable. One night, after a particularly long day at work, she went down to the basement only to find the mannequin was no longer in the corner. Instead, it was halfway across the room, its blank face directed right at the staircase. Erin's breath caught in her throat. She laughed nervously, telling herself she must have somehow bumped into it. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Over the next few days, Erin grew more cautious. She would glance at the mannequin whenever she went downstairs, making a mental note of where it stood. Yet every time she returned, it seemed to inch closer, as if it had a life of its own, inching towards her, step by step. One evening, after locking up all the windows and doors, she settled into bed, only to hear the faint sound of movement coming from the basement. A soft, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Her heart pounded, and she gripped the covers tightly, hoping it was just the house settling. But the noise continued, slow and deliberate. The next morning, she braved the basement again. To her horror, the mannequin was now at the base of the staircase, almost as if it had been trying to climb up to her. It stood motionless, yet somehow seemed alive, as though it had paused, waiting. The air around it felt colder, heavy with an unseen presence. Erin couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the mannequin and shoved it back into the corner, determined to keep it there. But as soon as she turned around, she felt a prickling sensation down her spine, like eyes boring into her back. She rushed upstairs, heart racing, her mind spinning with fear. That night, sleep eluded her. She kept imagining the mannequin standing at the foot of her bed, leaning over her, watching with its featureless face. In the morning, she went downstairs to check. The mannequin had moved again. This time, it was halfway up the stairs. She was trembling by now. She knew she couldn't live with it any longer. Gathering her courage, she carried the mannequin outside to the backyard. She left it there, hoping to put an end to its disturbing movements. But as she turned to head back inside, she felt that same chill. She glanced back and saw the mannequin still standing there, unmoved, yet somehow more ominous than ever. That night, a loud thud jolted her awake. Her heart pounded as she lay there, paralyzed. She didn't want to investigate, but curiosity and fear drove her to check. She slowly opened her bedroom door, her skin prickling with fear. And there it was. The mannequin stood right outside her room, its blank face turned directly toward her. She screamed and ran back into her room, slamming the door shut. She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained that someone or something was in her house. The officers arrived and searched every corner, but found nothing. They assured her she was safe, yet that did little to comfort her. The next night, Erin locked every door, every window, making sure nothing could get in. Yet somehow she could still feel the mannequin's presence. She turned off the lights, her eyes darting around the darkened room, her mind racing with dread. Then she heard it, a soft, barely there scratching coming from the hallway. With trembling hands, she opened the door a crack. The mannequin was right there, standing closer than ever, almost as if it had been waiting for her. She slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and pressed her back against it, hoping it wouldn't come any closer. But the scratching continued. And each time she checked, the mannequin seemed closer, inching forward with each heartbeat. She tried moving it back down to the basement, but it returned on its own, relentlessly creeping up, as if drawn to her. Days turned into sleepless nights. Erin could no longer live in her own home. Everywhere she went, she felt the mannequin's cold, unblinking presence, its shadow lurking just out of sight. She finally decided to move out, leave everything behind. As she left the house for the last time, she glanced back at the basement stairs. There at the top stood the mannequin, silent and still, as if bidding her a final farewell. It was over, or so she thought. But when she reached her new home, unpacking her things in an attempt to leave the nightmare behind, she heard it. A faint scraping, like something heavy being dragged. And when she turned, there it was. The mannequin. It had followed her. There's something haunting about the silence that falls over a house at night. It's an unnatural quiet, like the world is holding its breath, waiting. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the shadows cast by the streetlights flickered against the walls of Alex's room, casting strange shapes that seemed to move and stretch. He wasn't usually one to be afraid of the dark, but tonight was different. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. And then, as if out of nowhere, he heard it. A soft, slow, deliberate breathing, so faint it almost blended into the silence, yet there was something unmistakably human about it. It was coming from beneath his bed. His body tensed, frozen with an instinctual fear that whispered for him not to move. Every hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the breathing continued, steady, unhurried, as if whatever was lying under there knew he was listening. Alex lay still, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. It didn't make sense. He was alone in the house. His parents were out for the night, and no one else was supposed to be there. Yet the breathing persisted, chillingly close, like someone lying just inches away, separated only by the mattress. He didn't dare look, didn't even want to move his head toward the edge of the bed. As the minutes dragged on, Alex's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Could it be an intruder who'd slipped in somehow? Or something worse, something lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself? He felt a cold sweat break out over his skin as he strained to hear more. A faint shuffling noise followed, as if whatever was beneath him was adjusting its position. The mattress creaked ever so slightly, and he felt a faint pressure against the bed, as though something had brushed up against it from underneath. He clutched his sheets, his knuckles turning white as he tried to stay perfectly still, praying that whatever was down there wouldn't notice him. The breathing paused, and a low, barely perceptible whisper reached his ears. It was a sound that barely scraped the edge of hearing, a voice that seemed to crawl inside his head rather than reach his ears. "Don't look," it hissed, a breathy, sinister command that made his blood run cold. He squeezed his eyes shut, his mind racing with the horror of what might be waiting for him if he dared to glance over the side. Every instinct told him to stay still, to act as if he hadn't heard it. But a darker, more curious part of his mind urged him to see, to confirm if the nightmare was real. After what felt like hours, he dared to shift his position ever so slightly, his hand reaching for his phone on the nightstand. His fingers trembled as he fumbled for the screen, hoping to use the light to dispel whatever was lurking in the shadows. But just as he turned it on, he caught a glimpse of something horrific in the reflection. A pale, hollow-eyed face was staring up at him from beneath the bed, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. The eyes, sunken and devoid of life, seemed to pierce through him, as if it could see every thought, every fear, every heartbeat. He gasped, dropping the phone, the image searing itself into his mind like a brand. The breathing stopped. In the newfound silence, a sudden shift in the atmosphere sent chills crawling up his spine. Whatever was under the bed had moved closer, as if emboldened by his reaction, feeding on his fear. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and filled with the promise of something darker, something that lay just beneath the surface. Just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, he felt the bed shift slightly, as if something were pressing up against it from below. Panic gripped him, and his mind screamed at him to run, to bolt out of the room and escape whatever nightmare he was trapped in. But he couldn't move. His body felt as if it were glued to the bed, paralyzed by fear. Then came the scratching. A faint, dragging sound from beneath, like nails scraping against the wood floor, moving ever so slowly. He felt it vibrate through the mattress, the steady rhythm taunting him, tearing him to look, to confirm what his mind was trying to deny. Suddenly, the whispers returned, soft but insistent, crawling up from the shadows. "Look at me. Look at me." It beckoned, the voice a twisted blend of malice and hunger. as if it were relishing the fear it was causing. Alex's heart pounded faster, the fear so intense it felt as if his chest might explode. He was fighting a war within himself. Part of him wanted to escape, to run as far as he could, but another part, a dark curiosity, kept him frozen, unwilling to leave, needing to know what was beneath him. But he was beginning to realize that he might not have a choice. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, echoing in his mind, each word laced with venom. "Look at me. See what I am," it demanded, the voice like a chorus of horrors, as if 1,000 tortured souls were crying out at once. With a shaky breath, Alex made up his mind. His hand moved slowly, inching toward the edge of the bed, drawn by an uncontrollable compulsion. Every nerve screamed in protest, but he was beyond reason now, too entranced by the darkness that awaited him. As he tilted his head and peered over the edge, he found himself face to face with a creature of nightmares. It was a twisted, ghastly figure, its skin mottled and pale, its mouth stretched into a jagged smile that defied human anatomy. The hollow eyes stared at him, drinking in his fear as its long, bony fingers reached up toward his face. In that moment, he knew that what lay beneath his bed was not of this world. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, feeding on fear, thriving in the darkness. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat as the figure moved closer, its icy breath washing over him. The hand extended inches from his face, and he could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that went straight to his bones. His mind screamed at him to pull away, but he was frozen, captivated by a horrific, lifeless gaze. The creature's grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, impossibly sharp teeth. The reality of the moment struck him like a punch to the gut. This creature wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was real as the bed he was lying on, as real as the shadows dancing on his walls. He could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on his chest, suffocating him with its malevolence. Desperation clawed at him, but his body refused to obey, paralyzed under the creature's hypnotic gaze. It leaned closer, so close he could feel its breath, stale and rotten, washing over his face. His skin crawled with the sensation, a cold shiver racing down his spine as the creature's whispered words echoed in his mind, louder and more insistent. "You belong to me now," it rasped, the words dripping with a sense of finality, a declaration that sent waves of dread crashing through him. He could feel its intent, a dark, unrelenting hunger that seemed to reach deep into his soul. It wasn't going to let him go. It had claimed him, and there was no escape. Finally, with a surge of willpower, Alex forced his body to move. He broke free from the creature's gaze, rolling off the bed and stumbling to his feet, his heart racing as he backed toward the door. But as he reached for the doorknob, he heard the creature's voice once more, soft but menacing, a promise that chilled him to the core. "Run all you want. I'll be waiting." The words lingered in the air, filling the room with a dark energy that seemed to seep into the walls, embedding itself in the very essence of the place. He tore out of his room, not daring to look back, his feet pounding down the hallway as he raced toward the front door. He could feel the creature's presence behind him, a dark, looming shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire house, filling every corner with its darkness. The house felt alive, the walls pressing in on him as he ran, each step echoing with the creature's mocking laughter. Every shadow, every flicker of light seemed to twist into a face, a reminder of the horror lurking just behind him. Finally, he burst through the front door, stumbling out into the night, gasping for breath as he collapsed on the lawn. The cold night air felt like a slap to the face, shocking him back to reality as he lay there, trembling, his mind racing with the memory of what he had just seen. As he looked back at the house, he could see a faint shadow in his bedroom window, a figure watching him, its hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that would never be satisfied.